The morning board meeting at St. Jude's Hospital was tense. Mr. Sterling, the new efficiency-driven CEO, was pacing the room, pointing at colorful charts showing profit margins and patient turnover rates. Elena, a nurse with 10 years of experience, stood at the back, quietly taking notes. When she spoke up about a minor flaw in the new intake process for military veterans, Sterling cut her off with a cold stare. "Stick to your role, Elena. This isn't your level of expertise." The room went silent. She simply nodded. But the next morning, a call came from the Marine Corps Liaison Office. They were looking for her. Everything changed forever today. The Metropolitan Medical Center was a gleaming tower of glass and steel, a place that prided itself on being at the cutting edge of modern medicine. It was also a hospital that held a prestigious contract with the Department of Defense, serving as a primary care hub for active duty members and veterans of the Marine Corps. Elena had worked in the trauma and rehabilitation wing for nearly a decade. She wasn't a department head. She didn't have an MBA. She was a nurse who lived in the details, the small, flickering indicators of human suffering that a computer screen could never catch. Elena was 29, and her eyes had seen enough to fill several lifetimes. She was the kind of nurse who noticed the way a patient's breathing hitched when the automatic doors opened too loudly. She noticed the way a veteran's pulse would spike, not because of pain, but because of the flickering fluorescent light in the hallway. She understood the unspoken language of those who had served. To her, a patient wasn't a room number or a case study. They were a person with a history, often a fragile one. The hospital's new CEO, Arthur Sterling, saw things differently. He was a man of spreadsheets and optimization. He believed that the path to success lay in throughput, the speed at which a patient could be admitted, treated, and discharged. To Sterling, the hospital was a machine, and every minute wasted was a dollar lost. He viewed the nursing staff as technical operators, human components required to execute his vision of corporate precision. He rarely stepped onto the wards. To him, the reality of the hospital existed only in the data streams he analyzed on his high-resolution monitors. On this particular Tuesday morning, Sterling had gathered the senior medical staff and a few frontline representatives to unveil his efficiency-first initiative. He wanted to reduce the intake time for the rehabilitation wing by 15%. He pointed to a slide showing a streamlined digital questionnaire. The air in the boardroom was cold, sanitized, and smelled faintly of expensive coffee and leather. "We're spending too much time on narrative history," Sterling announced, his voice echoing in the sterile conference room. "The digital portal should handle 90% of the background. By the time the nurse sees the patient, they should be ready for vitals and immediate assessment. No more long-form conversations. We need to clear the beds. We need to move away from anecdotal care and toward algorithmic efficiency." Elena looked at the proposed questionnaire. She saw what was missing. She raised her hand, her voice steady and calm, breaking the rhythmic silence of Sterling's pacing. "Mr. Sterling, the new portal skips the sensory processing assessment for our veteran patients. Specifically, it lacks a query regarding acoustic and environmental triggers. If we skip that at intake, we risk placing a combat veteran in a high-traffic zone. That could lead to a reactive episode, a significant psychological event, before they even see a doctor." Sterling stopped pacing. He looked at Elena, his expression one of amused dismissal. He didn't ask for her reasoning. He didn't ask for her data. He saw a nurse's uniform, and he saw a barrier to his progress. To him, she was an obstacle in a blue scrub top, a remnant of a slower, less profitable era of medicine. "Elena, is it?" Sterling said, leaning against the mahogany table. "I appreciate the sentiment, but we are running a world-class medical facility, not a social club. The digital portal is based on the latest efficiency models from the corporate sector. We need to focus on the macro-level operation. Your job is to follow the protocol we provide. Stick to your role. This simply isn't your level of decision-making." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. The senior doctors looked at their clipboards. The head nurse shifted uncomfortably in her seat, avoiding Elena's gaze. Elena didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply took a slow breath, made a note in her journal, and nodded. "Understood, sir," she said. The meeting adjourned shortly after. Sterling walked out, confident that he had silenced a minor nuisance. Elena walked back to her ward, her mind already moving past the insult. She knew the CEO was focused on the numbers, but she was focused on the people. She knew that in a hospital, a minor detail was often the difference between a successful recovery and a catastrophic event. She spent the rest of her shift doing exactly what she always did, observing, listening, and documenting the things that the digital portal would never understand. She kept her own log of sensory triggers, a private map of safety for the men and women under her care. She didn't know it yet, but the very detail she had tried to warn Sterling about was about to become the center of a national inquiry. Wednesday afternoon was always the busiest time at the rehab center. The air was thick with the sound of beeping monitors, rattling meal carts, and the low hum of industrial floor buffers. It was exactly the kind of environment Elena had warned the CEO about, a chaotic symphony of triggers for a mind tuned to the battlefield. A new patient arrived at 1400. His name was Staff Sergeant Miller, a former Marine who had spent 3 tours in high-intensity combat zones. He was here for a routine post-surgical rehabilitation on his leg, but the moment he crossed the threshold of the hospital, his body was on high alert. He walked with a slight limp, his eyes scanning the ceilings for cameras or threats. Under Sterling's new efficiency-first protocol, Miller had been processed through the digital portal. He had been assigned to a bed in the main ward, a high-traffic area right next to the nursing station and the main elevators. It was the fastest way to manage his care, logistically perfect, but psychologically devastating. Elena saw him being wheeled in. She didn't need a monitor to see the signs. Miller's jaw was locked. His knuckles were white as he gripped the armrests of his wheelchair. His eyes were darting toward every loud noise, every sudden movement. He was stable, according to the vitals the intake nurse had recorded, but he was emotionally redlining. The sound of the elevator dings, the sharp ping of the doors, hit him like a physical blow. The efficiency-first guidelines stated that the nurse should spend no more than 8 minutes on the initial bedside orientation. But Elena knew that if she followed that rule, Miller wouldn't last the hour without a breakdown. The system was blind to the sweat on his forehead and the way his pupils were dilating in the bright overhead lights. "Sergeant Miller," Elena said softly, stepping into his peripheral vision so as not to startle him. "My name is Elena. I'm your primary nurse for this shift. I'm going to make a few adjustments to your room assignment." A junior administrator, eager to please Sterling and protect the new metrics, stopped her in the hallway. "Nurse Elena, bed 402 is assigned to Sergeant Miller. It's the most efficient location for the physical therapy team to reach him. Why are you moving him to the quiet bay in the West Wing? That's further away from the station. You're adding 3 minutes to every round." "He's a combat veteran with a history of acoustic sensitivity," Elena replied, her hands steady as she pushed the wheelchair. "The main ward is too loud. The elevators and the carts will trigger a high cortisol response. He needs a low-stimulus environment to recover from his surgery. If he's in bed 402, he won't sleep. And if he doesn't sleep, his healing will stall. His blood pressure will spike and will end up losing more time in the long run." "But the CEO specifically said—" "The CEO isn't the one standing in front of this patient," Elena interrupted, her voice firm, immovable. "I am. Tell the PT team they'll have to walk an extra 30 seconds. I'm prioritizing the patient's stability over your dashboard metrics." She moved Miller to the West Wing, a quiet corner of the hospital that had been largely ignored by the new efficiency model because it was logistically inconvenient. She dimmed the lights. She placed a sign on the door requesting quiet. She spent 20 minutes, not 8, talking to him, not about his surgery, but about his environment. She asked him about the sounds that bothered him. She discovered he couldn't stand the sound of metal sliding on metal, the sound of the medication cart's drawers. "Thank you," Miller whispered, his posture finally beginning to soften. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since he left the transport van. "Most places, they just treat me like I'm broken. They don't listen to the noise in my head. They just want me to sign the forms and be quiet." Elena documented everything. She recorded the decrease in his heart rate once he was moved to the quiet zone. She recorded the fact that he was able to complete his first round of physical therapy without the need for additional anti-anxiety medication. It was a clear, data-driven success, but it was a success that contradicted Sterling's model by requiring more unstructured nursing time. While Elena was working, the hospital's data system was flagging her. She was off protocol. She was inefficient. The system saw her as a red dot on a map of green efficiency, an outlier that needed to be corrected. What the system didn't see was the phone call being made from the Marine Corps Liaison Office. They were reviewing the intake data of their personnel at St. Jude's. They noticed something strange. Every other hospital using the new digital portal was reporting a spike in incident reports, agitation, falls, and readmissions for veterans. But at St. Jude's, in Elena's ward, the numbers were different. The veterans there were recovering faster, using less medication, and reporting higher satisfaction. The Marine officials didn't care about Sterling's profit margins. They cared about their people. They noticed that a specific nurse was consistently overriding the automated system to provide specialized care. They noticed that she was using a sensory assessment protocol that the CEO had officially dismissed. By the time the sun went down on Wednesday, the Department of Defense was already drafting an inquiry. They didn't want to talk to the CEO. They wanted to talk to the woman who had noticed what the machine had missed. Thursday morning began with a storm. Not outside, but inside the executive suite of St. Jude's Hospital. Arthur Sterling was in a rage. He had just received a notification that his Efficiency First model was being audited by the Marine Corps. To Sterling, an audit was a threat to his reputation, a stain on his record of corporate perfection. He assumed there had been a technical error, or perhaps a failure of the staff to follow his instructions. He called an emergency meeting. The same people who had been there on Tuesday were back, looking even more nervous. The air was thick with the scent of anxiety. Elena was there too, standing in her usual spot, unmoved by the storm. "I have just been informed," Sterling said, his voice trembling with suppressed anger, "that our military partners are questioning our intake protocols. They claim our veteran care is inconsistent with their safety guidelines. This is unacceptable. I gave clear instructions. I provided a digital portal to ensure uniformity. Who has been deviating from the protocol? Who has been wasting time on unauthorized assessments? We are losing credibility by the second." He looked directly at Elena, his eyes burning with accusation. Before he could speak, the doors to the conference room opened. A man in a sharp suit, accompanied by a high-ranking Marine officer in full uniform, walked in. The officer's boots clattered on the floor with a rhythmic military precision. This was not a social visit. This was a site inspection. "Mr. Sterling," the man in the suit said. He was the director of Veteran Health Affairs for the region. "I'm here because we have a significant discrepancy in our data. We've been monitoring the transition to your new digital intake system. Across 3 other hospitals, we've seen a 12% increase in post-surgical complications for our Marines. They are being placed in environments that trigger their PTSD, leading to sleep deprivation and stalled healing. It's a disaster." Sterling tried to smile, his corporate charm failing him, cracking like dry paint. "Director, I assure you we are simply in a transition phase. We are optimizing our throughput. Some staff members are still adjusting to the macro-level efficiency models. It's just a learning curve." The Marine officer stepped forward, his eyes like flint, hard and cold. "We're not interested in your throughput, Sterling. We're interested in the fact that yesterday, one of our staff sergeants, a man with 3 Purple Hearts, was admitted here. Your system tried to put him in a high-traffic trauma bay. If that had happened, he would have been back in the ER within 4 hours in the middle of a full-blown panic attack." Sterling felt a cold sweat on his neck. "Well, I'm sure we corrected that. The system is designed to—" "The system didn't correct it," the officer interrupted, his voice sharp as a blade. "A human did. We reviewed the nursing logs. We saw that a nurse named Elena explicitly overrode your digital assignment. She performed a sensory threshold assessment, the very assessment you told her was not her level on Tuesday. She recognized a threat that your digital questionnaire was blind to." The room went so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roar. Sterling turned his head slowly toward Elena. His face was a mask of shock and realization. The colorful charts on the wall suddenly seemed childish, irrelevant. "Nurse Elena," the director said, turning toward the back of the room, "we've been looking at your notes from the last 6 months. You've been manually tracking environmental triggers for every veteran admitted to this ward. Your data shows a 19% higher success rate for physical therapy when a patient is placed in a low-stimulus zone. You've been running a superior program under the radar. Elena stepped forward. She didn't look triumphant. She looked professional. It's a standard sensory processing protocol, sir. Many veterans from high-intensity environments have a lowered threshold for acoustic and visual stimuli. If we treat them like standard civilian patients, we are essentially setting them up for failure. The digital portal is efficient for logistics, but it is blind to trauma. It cannot see the man behind the heart rate. The Marine officer looked at Sterling. Why wasn't this implemented as a hospital-wide standard? We were told this facility was the gold standard for veteran care. Instead, we find that the only thing keeping our men safe is a nurse who had to defy your orders to do her job. Sterling opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at the charts on his wall, the ones showing the efficiency-first progress. They suddenly looked hollow, meaningless. He realized that his metrics were measuring speed, but Elena's metrics were measuring survival. She mentioned it on Tuesday, a junior doctor whispered, his voice barely audible. She told us the portal was missing the sensory assessment. Mr. Sterling told her to stick to her role. He said she didn't have the expertise to question the model. The director of Veteran Health Affairs didn't hide his disgust. Mr. Sterling, the Marine Corps doesn't partner with models. We partner with people. We provide funding for this facility because we were told you had the best frontline expertise in the country. It seems you have the expertise, but you've been trying to silence it in the name of profit. That ends today. The officer turned back to Elena. Nurse Elena, we are recommending that you be appointed as the lead consultant for the new Tri-Service Veteran Care Guideline. We want your manual logs to be the foundation for the new digital standards across the entire network. Starting this morning, you will be reporting Truk Taip to our liaison office regarding the implementation of these protocols at St. Jude's. You are now the safety authority for our personnel. Elena nodded. I would be honored, sir. I just want to make sure the patients have what they need to heal. I want to make sure they aren't fighting the hospital while they're trying to fight their injuries. Sterling stood there, a ghost in his own conference room. He realized that in his quest for macro-level success, he had ignored the very foundation of the hospital's value. He had dismissed the one person who actually understood the mission. He had tried to turn a nurse into a machine, only to find out that the machine was useless without the nurse's soul. By the time the meeting ended, the efficiency-first banners were already being taken down. The system was changing, and for the first time in a long time, the change was being led from the bedside, not the boardroom. The aftermath of the meeting was like a sudden drop in atmospheric pressure. The frantic, high-speed energy that had characterized Sterling's leadership disappeared overnight. It was replaced by a more measured, thoughtful atmosphere, a heavy quiet that allowed the staff to actually think. The physical changes to the hospital happened quickly. The West Wing was officially designated as the Veteran Sensory Recovery Zone. The acoustic assessments that Elena had been performing in her private notebook were formalized into the intake process. But the most significant change wasn't in the paperwork. It was in the way the staff looked at each other. They stopped looking at their tablets first and started looking at their patients. Elena didn't become a different person. She didn't move into a corner office or buy a new wardrobe. She stayed on the ward. She still wore her blue scrubs. But now when she walked through the halls, the senior doctors stopped to ask her opinion. The administrators, who had previously ignored her, now waited for her sign-off before making any changes to the patient flow. Mr. Sterling was still the CEO, but he was a humbled man, a man who had seen the bottom of his own ambition. He had narrowly avoided losing the hospital's largest contract and his career. On a rainy Friday afternoon, he found Elena in the West Wing, checking on a patient. He waited until she was finished, watching her adjust a blanket with a gentleness he didn't realize existed, before approaching her. "Nurse Elena," he said, his voice lacking its usual corporate edge. It sounded human, vulnerable. "Do you have a moment?" "Of course, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice as calm as ever. He looked at the quiet ward, the dimmed lights, and the calm patients who were actually sleeping, not just medicated. "I spent my career believing that the only way to save a hospital was to treat it like a business. I thought that the details, the things you care about, were just noise in the system. I thought they were inefficient. I was wrong. I didn't realize that the noise is the hospital. Elena looked at him. She didn't seek an apology. She didn't need one. But she appreciated the awareness. A business is about the bottom line, Mr. Sterling. A hospital is about the baseline. If we don't understand where a patient is starting from, physically, mentally, and environmentally, we can't help them get to where they need to go. Efficiency is only valuable if it leads to a better outcome. Speed without care is just a faster way to fail. You can't optimize a soul with an algorithm. Sterling nodded. The Marines made it very clear that they won't renew our contract unless you are in a leadership position over the veteran programs. I'd like you to take the role of Director of Integrated Care. You'll have the authority to override any efficiency protocol that you believe compromises patient safety. You will be the check and balance for this entire facility. I'll take the role, Elena said, but on one condition. I stay on the floor for at least 2 shifts a week. I can't lead the care if I don't see the patients. I can't understand the noise if I'm sitting in an office. Sterling smiled, a real smile this time, one that reached his eyes. I think that's a very good idea. In fact, I think I'll join you once a week for rounds. I need to learn how to see the details again. The change rippled out to the other nurses. They saw that Elena had been rewarded for her courage and her expertise, not her compliance. They began to speak up more. They began to share the details they had been noticing. The hospital became a place of collaborative intelligence rather than top-down mandates. It became a place where the smallest observation was treated with the highest respect. Elena sat at the nursing station late that evening, looking over her notes. She thought back to the Tuesday meeting, to the moment Sterling had told her to stick to her role. She realized that she had done exactly that. Her role wasn't just to follow orders. Her role was to be the guardian of her patients. She had stayed true to the details, even when the world told her they didn't matter. She looked out at the quiet hallway, where a veteran was sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks. She knew that she hadn't just saved a contract, she had saved a standard of care. She closed her journal and prepared for the next shift, knowing that the most important work would always be done in the silence between the heartbeats. The story of Elena and the CEO is a modern parable for our time. We live in an era of macro-level thinking, where data points and efficiency models often replace human intuition. We are told that the system is the solution, and that individuals should simply fit themselves into the gears of progress. We are told that empathy is a luxury we can no longer afford in the name of the bottom line, but a hospital, or any organization that deals with human lives, is not a machine. It is a living, breathing ecosystem. And in any ecosystem, it is the sentinel, the person who notices the subtle changes in the environment, who is the most valuable. It is the one who sees the birds stop singing before the storm hits. Elena was a sentinel. She didn't have the highest title, but she had the deepest vision. She understood that in the world of high-stakes trauma and veteran care, the small stuff is actually the big stuff. A flickering light, a loud elevator, or a dismissive intake form can be just as damaging as a surgical error. It is the cumulative weight of these details that determines whether a person heals or breaks. The CEO's mistake was a common one. He confused rank with expertise. He assumed that because he was at the top of the hierarchy, he had the best view of the reality. He didn't realize that the higher you go in a building, the further you get from the ground. It is the people on the ground, the nurses, the teachers, the technicians, who truly understand the terrain. It is their hands that touch the reality every single day. This story carries a vital message for anyone in a position of leadership. Listen to the people who do the work. Don't let your models blind you to the reality of the people they are meant to serve. And never ever dismiss a professional who has the courage to speak up about a detail. Their observation might be the only thing keeping your system from collapsing. For the frontline workers, the Elenas of the world, the lesson is just as clear. Your value is not determined by your title. Your expertise is found in your observation and your responsibility. And even when the system tells you to be quiet, stay focused on the truth of what you see. You are the last line of defense for those in your care. The Marine Corps didn't call the CEO because they wanted to discuss his efficiency model. They called because they recognized that one person was providing a level of care that the model had forgotten. They recognized that the details were actually the mission. They recognized that humanity is the ultimate efficiency. In the end, Elena's success wasn't just about saving a contract or getting a promotion. It was about the fact that she refused to ignore the truth. She understood that in the world of healing, there is no such thing as a minor detail. Every observation is a thread in the fabric of a person's recovery. By standing her ground, she reminded the entire institution that medicine is not a business of throughput. It is a business of trust. And trust is earned in the small, quiet moments where one person chooses to listen to another. The CEO almost walked past her. He almost silenced her. But the truth has a way of making itself heard, especially when it is spoken by someone who refuses to look away. They didn't call because of her title. They called because she noticed what others didn't. And in that noticing, she changed everything. They didn't call because of her title. They called because she noticed what others didn't.